The jury returns to the courtroom at 8:30 tomorrow morning, at which time Mark O'Mara will begin the defense's closing argument. The state will then have the opportunity to rebut the defense's closing, and then the judge will charge the jury and the case will be theirs. Back with me, Lisa Bloom, Faith Jenkins, and Marcia Clark. I want to listen to something that Mark O'Mara said. He's going to be up there tomorrow. What he said when he was arguing for basically a directed verdict at the end of the prosecution's case, saying that they failed to make their case. It came down to this one line.
Trayvon Martin did, in fact, cause his own death.
Marcia Clark, that is what they have to argue to this jury, that George Zimmerman did not cause that death. The death was caused, and Trayvon Martin's death was caused by Trayvon Martin.
That's right. They're going to have to point to whatever they can to try and establish that George Zimmerman was not the aggressor, that Trayvon Martin was, and that George Zimmerman had no choice ultimately but to shoot at Trayvon Martin. And so what they're going to point to, I'm sure, is number one thing is the way that the ballistic evidence showed there was no stippling and tattooing on the skin of Trayvon Martin's body, and that the entry into the hoodie seemed to be closer in range, which indicates that the hoodie was kind of hanging away from his body. Their argument will be that that means he was leaning over George Zimmerman, which is consistent with their story that he was on top of George Zimmerman and beating him. That's going to be a key piece of evidence for them. As well, they'll point to George Zimmerman's injuries and rely very heavily on Dr. DeMaio's testimony to show that he was reasonably in fear of imminent danger. I think those are going to be the key points for them. Of course, the 911 tape as well, but I think that particular football has been back and forth across the field so many times. I'm not sure the jury is even going to be able to sort out what they think about who was the screaming one. And
Lisa Bloom, the defense presumably will want to stay on the fight as much as they possibly can, because it's only within the moments, whatever that is, minutes of that fight, that the justification for homicide can exist.
Yeah, here's the best defense argument. You know what? George Zimmerman probably did make some terrible assumptions about Trayvon Martin. He probably did profile him. That was a big mistake. He shouldn't have done that. But it wasn't illegal. And he's not on trial for profiling and making assumptions, because that's not a crime. He got out of the car, he followed, but then he was assaulted, then he was attacked. And they're just going to get into the physical fight and all of their medical and legal evidence in support of that. I hope that the prosecution on rebuttal points out that Trayvon Martin was wearing a baggy sweatshirt that gathered at the bottom, that would have been away from his body even in a standing position, that the outer sweatshirt would be even further from his body, so the 2 to 4 inch range is really not all that significant.
Faith, I've many times I've heard jurors mention things after deliberations and after the verdict is in that no lawyer mentioned in the closing, that here was the fact, here was the thing that made me vote this way. Is there anything that you can think of that a juror might be picking up that the prosecution has underemphasized or didn't really lean on today, or something that on the defense side they might grab onto that Mark O'Mara hasn't used so much?
The prosecutors cannot state with specificity what happened in that altercation between Trayvon and George Zimmerman. So they're going after the defendant's statement saying he's a liar, you can't believe his story, and this child is dead. But if there's anything that I think the jurors are going to look at in the prosecutor's arguments, it is that they don't know. But they're saying we don't have to know. We know that Trayvon Martin is dead and he is a liar. And why is he lying? Because it's consciousness of guilt, because he murdered him. But that may be a sticking point. And
let's listen to this part about Dr. DeMaio's testimony. I just want to listen to this.
Based upon the concentration of the marks and the size of the pattern, it's my opinion that the muzzle of the gun in this case was 2 to 4 inches away from the skin. So the barrel of the gun was against the clothing. The muzzle of the gun was against the clothing, but the clothing itself had to be 2 to 4 inches away from the body at the time Mr. Martin was shot. So the wound itself, by the gap, by the powder tattooing, in the face of a contact of the clothing indicates that this is consistent with Mr. Zimmerman's account that Mr. Martin was over him, leaning forward at the time he was shot.
Marcia Clark, is that possibly the single most important piece of testimony that the prosecution has to overcome?
You know, I don't think so, Lawrence. I'm not that impressed with that testimony. I know it's been cited as a big deal for them, but I agree with Lisa. There are so many positions that Trayvon could have been in to have the sweatshirt fall away. Don't forget, too, you know, I mean, it's a rainy night. I don't know quite how that sweatshirt fit him. He could be standing straight up, and it could still be a little bit hanging away from him. He was very thin. So and 2 to 4 inches is not a lot of room. It's not huge. It's not billowing out a foot in front of him. So I don't think it's that big a deal.
The last word tonight has to go to Marcia Clark. We are out of time. Marcia, thank you. Faith Jenkins, Lisa Bloom, thank you all for joining me tonight and this week. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.